love it. I like it. Okay, well, have a seat.
Okay.
Have a seat. Hopefully the pink matches Brooklyn's beautiful couch coral, but it's okay if it doesn't. Oh my gosh, and I really I have not spoken to her. This is really my first time. Hi,
Nice to
Natalie,
meet
I'm
you.
April.
Hi, April. Nice to meet you.
There were so many things about your story that, for me personally, resonated up until the part of losing your husband. But I work in storytelling. I work with women's stories all day long. I was a journalist. I worked in the TV world. You were in the radio world.
I did some TV too. I love radio because you don't have to do all of this.
I know. I should have done that. But I've met celebrities. I've interviewed celebrities. I've done some really cool things, And I met my husband early in college. I did marry the unicorn first off, so I'm very blessed. I feel like I've also had a very blessed life. I don't have some big, and I work with women all the time, I don't really have a story. And, but you do. Even you had a story even before your husband died. And I kind of wanted to start there because I think there's a lot of women in this audience that have a story. You know what you're going through. You've been through some very hard things, and you know that that's a part of your story. But there are a lot of women in the audience that have even been through some hard things, but they still feel really blessed, and they don't feel like their story is as important as others that have suffered greater loss than they. So even before your husband died, did you think much about what was your story? Was that even something that you were conscious of?
No, I really, like I mentioned, had such an easy life that there were never these huge peaks and valleys. And my husband, he was a pastor, then he was an entrepreneur, and I think our biggest stressor in marriage was the financial aspect of owning your own business and losing business and starting businesses again. But even through that, really hard times financially, never once, Wayne never was complaining about that. He was like, yeah, business life sucks, but man, I've got a healthy wife and kids, and God has blessed us. And we really just always had this outlook God's got us. He's going to take care of us. I don't know how we're going to pay the light bill, but God's got us. And so I really never struggled with the fear and anxiety. And I think because I've had such a strong faith my whole life. And that's where I am. And when I would talk with friends who struggle with the fear and anxiety, I just could not relate to it. And I was like, snap out of it. Come on. And as I'm meeting with widows, so I call myself the widow collector, because every week a friend will reach out and tell me, my friend's husband died, can you reach out to her? And I always say yes in about a month. She does not want to talk to me right now. And we have a little local widowettes Facebook page, and there's 80 of us now, all young widows who've lost their husbands in their 30s or 40s or 50s. And I tell these women who are in that state of anger and questioning and why, would a good God let something like this happen to me? And if God is God, He's not going to let us figure it out. We're never going to have the answers to it. And I don't want to worship a God that I can figure out. That's not God. And so I've never questioned, and I struggle with prayer because I'm always like, who am I to ask God to do this, that, and the other? You're God. You know what to do. So I've always struggled with the prayer aspect, because I trust God completely, even in the midst of my circumstance and because of my circumstance. There's always been this strong faith. And so I think my story has always been, all right, whatever comes our way, we're going to roll with it. And Wayne was the same way. And so that's, I think, what I appreciate. What was great about our marriage was we just never, our marriage should have fallen apart with the financial stress we were under. But we just never let it, because we're like, okay, God, we're going to figure it out.
And I think that whether it's a loss of a husband or a divorce, that's a similar loss, or, as you said earlier, sickness, cancer, disease, just financial ruin, whatever it is, there's a story being woven through all of us. And one thing that I was thinking about is that things don't happen to us, right? They happen for us. And it seems like you have a great perspective on that now that you can look back and see. And I always say with storytelling that a lot of times you have to get to the other side of things before you can truly see God's stitching and weaving and how things were really supposed to play out. And thinking back, too, to Tammy's message this morning that we all have the same purpose. When you started, and this was so recent that you started your nonprofit, I would love to know a little bit more about how that idea came to you. Because, I mean, you can kind of see it now. Like, God has given you this story, and it's for you, not to you. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about how the project came about.
Wayne died in August, and I knew as Christmas was approaching, I did not want to be home with the boys for the holidays because it was going to be too hard. We had a friend. Wayne was a singles pastor at Irving Bible Church years before, right when we first got married, and one of the girls that used to be in our singles ministry was an actress up in New York. I hadn't seen her in 10 years. She'd flown here for the service, and I was talking with her afterwards, and she was like, hey, if you and the boys ever want to get away, I've got a 3-bedroom apartment in New York. And I was like, I got the boys and me on a plane on Christmas Eve, and we spent a week making memories. And for me, there's a thing called widow's fog. It is a true thing. It's kind of like this trauma through the PTSD. You can't think, you can't plan. For me to try to plan a trip with my boys and then navigate New York, there's no way I could have done that. But I could get us on a plane. I could get us to show up. And so we were there, and like I said, there's a lot of guilt that comes with moving forward and having fun and just making memories. And so it was a great kind of first step for me. I actually, the next fall, ended up taking the boys to Washington, D.C. all by myself because I'd kind of gotten my confidence boost from New York. And then shortly after that trip to New York is when I met the unicorn, Shell, and we started dating, and we met November 2019, and we're engaged March 2020, right when the world's shutting down. And he's planning to sell his house. He lived up in Prosper, Salina area, and he's packing up the kitchen, I'm packing up the bathroom, and we had started thinking, like, what can we do as a couple? And he had been in the restaurant industry for 30 years. He had to let 400 people go the week prior, and then his partners decided to let him go, and which is such a blessing because he would have never left. He wasn't content and happy there, been there for 6 years, and they'd been promising things and never fulfilled it, but he would have never left on his own. So God was just kind of kicking him out of the nest. So we were at a place like, what could we do? And my background is media, and I do presentation and communication skills to executives traveling all around the country, which that had been shut down because of COVID. And he was the COO of a restaurant group where he was doing more leadership development of the managers. And so we were like, what can we do? Kind of to work together, to travel around and do stuff like that. And also, we had thought about maybe flipping houses. His builder-grade house that he'd moved into 5 years prior when he got divorced was so, like, he had done concrete countertops and shiplap and barn doors. Like, he's just real crafty and just had an eye for creating things. And so we had thought about, maybe flipping houses or doing rental properties. And so I'm in the bathroom, he's in the kitchen, and I'm packing up, and I start thinking about my widows that I'd been collecting and moving forward, and I thought about the trip to New York, and then I'm like, what if we buy a house, and widows can come to our house to have their first step forward? And so I'm like, So I go to tell him my idea, and back up a little bit. For Wayne's service, so I mentioned the video that I'd shared that people had reached out. It had gone viral kind of on Facebook. So I'd done this video with Chris Stapleton's song Broken Halos, because Wayne was a huge Chris Stapleton fan. And for weeks after Wayne's service, that song, people would message me. They saw everywhere they went, that song was in a restaurant, it was on the car, that song was just following us around. I walk into the kitchen to tell Chell we'd been listening to Pandora, and right as I'm telling him this idea for a grief retreat for widows, guess what song pops on? And I go, we should call it Broken Halos Haven. And that's where the idea came. And I had a friend who was a realtor, and So we're preparing to get married in June, and she had started sending us email listings of houses that were for sale. And we really were open to anything central to DFW Airport because we wanted to make sure it was available to anybody in the country to come. And she'd been sending us listings, and really there was nothing that was kind of hitting us. And so the day after our wedding, I'm sitting in the hotel, the bed, getting my email, and I'm like, Jill, we need to go look at this house. He's like, today? I go, yeah, like right now. So Old Town Louisville, which is great because it's 10 minutes from our house in Flower Mound. And we go look at this house, and we walk through it, and we're like, yeah, it's not for us. So we're standing outside talking to our realtor, and we turn to the left, and we see this boarded up ramshackle house with a for sale sign in front of it. And I'm like, that's the one. So she calls the number on the sign, and the real estate agent, the listing agent, was like, oh, you can go in. The door's been kicked down.
It's open.
And, I mean, it's the middle of the day at noon, and it's pitch black in there because it's really all boarded up. So we're walking around with our iPhones, flashlights, thinking we're going to find squatters in there. And we're like, okay, this is it. And what's crazy is the listing agent had actually put the wrong zip code, so anyone who was looking for houses in Old Town Louisville would have never found that. And the only way we found it is because we looked at the house next door. So that's where we got Halos. And then that was August. Fast forward to February, August 2020, so February 2021. Remember that big ice storm that shut down the world?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
We decided that was the perfect week to buy another house 3 blocks away. We didn't tell anybody about it. It was this little 900-square-foot house, used to be a parsonage. It's on a back corner of a church 3 blocks from where Halos is. And we didn't know what we were going to do with it, but we felt God say, buy this. And so we didn't tell anyone because we didn't want to steal the excitement from Halos, and I didn't want people to think we're like slumlords of Old Town Louisville and just buying up random houses. So over the next few months, as I've collected more widows, the need, and as the mom of 3 boys, there's such the pressure to instill manly things into your boys because that dad is not there. And so my widows that have boys are just like, they feel this immense pressure. So we had the idea to start monthly man camps where these boys will come and meet with mentor men to teach them simple things like how to shake a hand, how to start a lawnmower, how to change the oil or whatever. So they come and get this mentorship each month and just learn the things that their dad's not there to teach them. And then also, there is a need for kids group grief counseling in our area. There are only 2 things actually in DFW for kids group grief therapy. There's a place called Journey to Hope in Plano, and they meet like on a Wednesday night, and then the Warm Place in Fort Worth, and they meet on a Tuesday night. It's not feasible to drive 45 minutes one way on a Tuesday night, and then neither of these are faith-based. So there is a definite need for something in Flower Mound, Coppell, Denton, that area. So we met with the founders of Shift, which is a curriculum that came out of Watermark Church. They were hosting Grief Share, which is an international group. Churches host this all over. And I went through Grief Share. Blah. The only reason I went was because they ran Shift concurrently, and I wanted my boys to be around other kids who've lost a parent. And so this was January after Wayne died. I'm like, all right, boys, let's go do it. And none of us wanted to go. And so we show up that night, and there's like 10 volunteers with their Shift shirt. And it's a sweet Baptist church with a bunch of sweet older ladies as the volunteers. And they're so excited for my boys, and they've lined the halls. And the boys walk into the room, and they are the only ones there, which reinforces kids don't usually lose their dads. And they gave my 15-year-old like a coloring sheet. It was just like not what he needed. And so they never came back. The boys, we started doing private counseling, which was useless too. That was just like spending money unnecessarily because my boys never talked to their therapist. They would just sit there. But we kept going because I wanted them to know when they were ready to talk about their grief, 5, 10, 20 years, when they're married and have their own kids, whenever they get to that point, I wanted them to think back to when they were a kid and went and saw a counselor, and it's okay. It's okay to go to a counselor. It's normal. So we did that for a few months. But going back to my widows group, there is a need for kids group grief therapy. And so this house that we bought, we're actually on Tuesday pouring the foundation for a garage, which is where we'll host man camp. And then over that is going to be an art studio where we will have, because art therapy is huge as part of the grief process for kids. And then it'll be a secondary grief retreat as well. So when Halos is filled up, widows and their family can stay at that house. We're going to call it The Haven. There's a verse in Psalms that said something like, when the storm was over, you found the haven. And so the storm of losing someone is there's turmoil, but then when you're ready, you go find the haven. So that's
so
what we're doing.
Beautiful. I love that. So do you see now like this beautiful purpose that's been designed for you, and how do you feel about it? Like how do you feel as that visionary and being, acting out in obedience and doing this work? Because these ideas were not all yours, right? I mean, so what's it like to see that and live it as your purpose now?
So we all have a story. There's this little phrase everyone keeps saying, like, this is my truth, this is my story. I'm like, it's not my story. This is God's story. God is the author of our story. From the day we're born to the day we die, he determines the course, the good, the bad, the ugly. But we are the editors. We're the ones who decide how our story is told. Just like a book editor refines and polishes and directs the attention to things you should focus on, we can focus on the hardships, the trials, be bitter and angry and waiting for the next bad thing to happen. We can edit our story that way. We can tell it that way. Or we can edit it to talk about, we've gone through hard things, but this is what I've learned from it. This is how I've changed. This is how I'm different, and this is how I can offer hope. So we all have a story. It's God's story. He's the author, but we're the editors. We determine how to tell it.
There's a lot of women that don't tell their story, though, even though they have all these stories. Yeah. What would you say to a woman who's holding on to a story and not sharing it?
When we did our pre-reno open house for Halos, this is where we invited all of our friends to see how crazy we were to buy this house. We planted a tree in Wayne's honor because Wayne would love when the boys would come home on Arbor Day with the scraggly little tree. He would say, hey, boys, there's a Chinese proverb. Do you know the best time to plant a tree? I don't know. 10 years ago. You know the second best time to plant a tree? Today. Meaning, don't put off until tomorrow what can be done today. If you'd planted that tree 10 years ago, it would be huge, bearing shade, strong living. So we bought this house. We call it the house that Google built because we had no clue what we were doing. We're just like, we planted our tree. And so that's what I tell people. Like, you can't have an Excel spreadsheet. You can't have it all figured out. Remember, we don't want to figure out God. But we do need to plant our trees. Just like Noah, he had to build an ark. There was no sign of rain, but he still had to build the ark. And so you do have to get out there, tell your story, decide how you're going to edit that story. Are you going to tell it like, oh, woe is me, all these horrible things keep happening, I'm just waiting for the shoe to drop for the next thing? Is that a way that God wants you to live? If our ultimate purpose on this earth is to glorify God and draw others to him, who are we to say how that's done? And that's when I'm sharing my story. I'm like, obviously, I would love for Wayne to be here. I would love for my boys to have their dad. But that's not how I'm supposed to draw others to him. I'm supposed to talk about the hardship we endured, but that we still have faith that God is good, even in the midst of horrible circumstances. So tell your story, edit it to draw others to Christ, and just plant your tree.
You know, I was sitting here thinking about Mary's story last night about, living this very godly life, being a leader at church, doing all the things, and then have a son that come home and says he's gay. And then she had to navigate that, and in that realization that she would have never reached a population of people had she not had that experience, not had to live out being the mother of a gay son. You would not have the opportunity to have the impact that you're having had you not Because you wouldn't be running a house for widows and have this haven and now ministering to young boys had you not had the hardship of losing your husband. And there's so many things that I think women hold on to around the story of you're not telling, right? Because it's the thing that you didn't really want. Nobody really signs up like, yeah, give me cancer. Sure, I'll take that, and I'll go tell everybody about it, and it'll be great, right? Nobody says that. And, I was talking with a friend that's here at our table discussion, and she was saying that the last few years, God hasn't been as present in her life because things have been good. But she's going through a bad, rough time right now, and God is showing up. And so what if in our challenges, right, losing your husband, going through a divorce, navigating a sickness, major financial loss, being the mother of a gay son, whatever it is, what if that is your God story? What if that's your God story? I feel like this is your God story. And that you're having the courage to share it. I mean, obviously you have talent and you have, background and media and all of that. But even if none of that was present, I feel like you would still be doing this work, broken halos, all these little God winks that have been woven in every single step of the way. And you shared so many of them with us today that you're just living out God's story for you.
Well, and like Lisa Turker's book that I quoted, anybody, you don't have to be on stage singing a song. She said, why does this happen? Because someone would drown in their own tears if not for seeing yours. And when you can make one other person feel seen and heard and they're not alone, that's why we go through hard things, because we can offer hope to others. So you don't have to be on stage to tell your story. Just share it.
Yeah, that is. I'm so glad you said that. I think that many women think that it has to be done a certain way, and it doesn't. It can be literally at the table, at your small group tables or over the phone with a friend. But to squander the opportunity of sharing your story would be an opportunity. It's like I shared earlier, scoop down and get him with you and let him tell it with you too is a big part of it.
Not to interrupt you, but I have gained a lot of empathy. Like, so when this guy broke my heart, I had always been, if I had a friend that had a bad relationship, I'm like, just go find someone else, move on. Because I'd never had my heart broken. And now I'm like, oh, it's not that easy. So the hardship that I went through, it gave me a lot of empathy and grace and compassion that I'd never had my whole life, because I've always been the suck it up buttercup kind of gal. But I do. I have this little tender heart now. Those who've known me for a while, I hate hugs, but when you're a widow, everyone wants to hug you and give you a book and a prayer shawl and a lot of Kleenex and cash and casseroles.
Casseroles.
Those are the things. But it does. It changes you when you go through the hard things. And it's a refining that God refined me. And yes, he had instilled in me things as a child. I love to get up here and sing, where most people don't. But isn't it cool that God planned for me to be doing this when I was a kid, that he wired me that way, that I have a theater background, a media background, and I married a guy who kind of similar to me, and it's just neat to see how God weaves your story. And our pastor talked about how God speaks in sentences, not paragraphs, meaning he's never going to give you the full story. And he used the example of, Peter, I need to borrow your boat. He never would have said, hey, Peter, I need to borrow your boat, and then you're going to give up everything in your life, and then you're going to do this, and this, you're going to reject me, and then you're going to have beheaded, and blah, 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 and we're going to look at you the rest of the life, and history is Peter, I need to borrow your boat. So whatever sentence God is saying to you, and maybe it is maybe I need to reach out to that woman that's going through something similar, and I need to have coffee with her. That's your plant your tree moment. That's the sentence, because who knows what that's going to lead to, because we don't know. And I live life differently because every day is a gift. I'm not guaranteed. I mean, I always, when you lose your spouse, you kind of can joke about things. So with Chell and I, we had gone to a funeral a couple weeks ago, and anytime you go to a funeral, you always leave and like, how would my funeral look like? And so we were talking about, I was like, this is who I want speaking at my funeral, and who do you want speaking at your funeral? And I said, obviously me, because I've done it before, and I already have the notes. I can just cross out Wayne's name and put your name. But you do just kind of have this perspective of like nothing is guaranteed. And so I just don't waste days anymore. And you can't have it all figured out. Just plant your tree and move forward and see what God can do with it.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing with us. One last question. What do you think Wayne, it was Wayne, right? What do you think Wayne would say about Broken Halos and the work that you're doing in the world today?
Oh my gosh, he had such a heart for widows and orphans. There was this, he was a missionary in Russia before he came back and was a pastor. And in between jobs, he was a property manager. This is right when we were married. He was a property manager for American Express Travel or whatever. And there was this sweet little Korean lady named Suka who she'd come over with her husband, but he died once they got over here. So she was this widow, did not speak a lick of English, did not have her driver's license, and she was probably 4'8", like teeny tiny. Wayne helped her get her driver's license. She had to have 3 cushions behind her to reach the steering wheel. And it's so funny because she wanted to take us to dinner as an appreciation for what he just had loved on her. And we don't know where we're going. All we heard, we picked her up, and she just says, Harry Hines. We knew we needed to get to Harry Hines. So, Harry Hines. So we got that far, and then she'd go, and she'd point to the directions to get to this restaurant. And we walked in this restaurant, and it was as if she was the queen of England, of Korea. I don't know what they have. She knew what, she's like barking orders at the whole staff. Like she was just like, which we had viewed her as this just sweet little timid widow lady. And she shows up in her domain. And it was so neat to see how Wayne's investment in her to give her a driver's license had empowered her now. Like she can get places and do things. And so for him to be able to see what we're doing, and I hate when people say, Wayne's smiling down at you, like peering through the clouds. I'm like, no, he's not. When we're in heaven, we're not looking down at all the junk going on in earth. Like he's going to, when I die, he's going to be like, oh, there you are. Like, we don't need to get all spiritual or get theology involved, but I just don't believe people are watching us from heaven. So, and Chell's like, hopes not, because he's like, when I get to heaven, Wayne's either going to high-five me or throat punch me. You know what I'm saying? But I know Wayne would be just thrilled at what we're doing.
Another little God-woven piece of that story. I love it so much. Thank you, Natalie, so much for sharing your story and reminding everybody to live a great story and to use those challenging moments in your life as part of your God story to share with others, right? Like this is just a moment. And when you get to the other side, you may be leading a nonprofit. You may be changing the world. Who knows?
You may be singing on stage.
You may be singing
Disney
on stage.
songs.
Or you might just be sitting with a girlfriend and saying, I got this. I know. I hear you. I've been there. And, we're going to do this. You're going to be okay. And that's really what the story is just reminding people, like, it's such a testament to see you, that what would I do if I lost my husband? I've been married 22 years. Was another thing that I caught up on with your story, had Wayne still been here. Like, gosh, what would I do if Kyle died? If I were to become a widow. And I hope that never happens, but you being here today, I'll remember that, if that ever happened. And I know that you're continuing to be a light to those widows that you get to work with every single day. What a blessing. Thank you so much. I don't know what we're doing next.
Where do we go
Kim.
now? What do I do with my hands?
That's all I got.